Diplomacy in Madrid continues. President Yoon Suk-yeol and Australian Prime Minister Anthony Albanese speak on the sidelines of the NATO meeting set for Wednesday to discuss expanding bilateral cooperation on energy and issues surrounding North Korea. The United States announces that Washington and its key economic allies are going to prohibit imports of Russian gold, acting on commitments made by the group of 7 leaders this week to further punish Russia over its invasion of Ukraine. With the deadline to decide the wage floor for next year drawing closer, discussions are still ongoing over South Korea's minimum wage. Labor unions are now proposing an increase of 12.9% due to rising inflation, while the business community is calling for a hike of 1.1%.
Hello and welcome to New Day at Arirang. It's Wednesday, June 29th, 8 a.m. here in Seoul, South Korea, and I'm Lee Seung-jae.
And I'm Lee Ji-eun, filling in for Oh Soo-young this week. Thanks for joining us this morning, because over the next hour, we'll be giving you a look at some of the biggest headlines of the day and experts' insights on issues facing Korea and the rest of the world. We begin over in Madrid, where President Yoon Suk-yeol met with the Australian Prime Minister ahead of the NATO meeting in Spain. The two leaders agreed to strengthen cooperation on democracy, energy, and North Korea issues.
That's right. More diplomatic events await the South Korean leader, including his debut at the NATO summit. For this, Yoon Jung-min starts us off.
South Korea and Australia will bolster coordination on democracy, green energy, as well as cooperation against North Korea's nuclear programs. This was agreed between the two recently elected leaders, South Korean President Yoon Suk-yeol and Australian Prime Minister Anthony Albanese, on Tuesday during a sideline one-on-one at NATO. Starting his first official diplomatic engagement in Spain, the South Korean leader spoke of his hopes for close cooperation with his Asia-Pacific partner.
알바니지 총리님 총선에서 좋은 결과를 거두신 것 거듭 축하드리고 취임 축하드립니다. 양국 모두 새 정부가 출범한 만큼 앞으로 양국 관계를 더욱 발전시키기 위해 긴밀히 협력해 나가기를 희망합니다.
Seoul's top office says the two countries will closely work together on democracy, human rights, and market economy, which they said are among the reasons South Korea and Australia are joining the NATO summit this time. Citing the Russian invasion of Ukraine, the Australian Prime Minister reportedly raised concerns over the impact of authoritarianism. To tackle climate change, South Korea declared hopes for further business cooperation on green hydrogen, an area where Australia excels, and the two leaders discussed cooperation on high-tech materials and the rare mineral supply chain. On security, Australia reaffirmed its willingness to cooperate for denuclearization of North Korea and the Korean Peninsula peace policy, while vowing to continue strict implementation of economic sanctions on the regime. Seoul also asked support from Australia for South Korea's bid to host the 2030 World Expo in Busan, and the two leaders have agreed to strengthen cooperation with the ASEAN and continue summit exchanges down the road. On the same evening, President Yoon Suk-yeol and First Lady Keon-hee attended a gala hosted by the King of Spain, Felipe VI. Meanwhile, President Yoon's scheduled meeting with NATO Secretary General has been put off due to lengthy talks with Turkey over Finland and Sweden's NATO membership request. Yoon Jung-min, Arirang News.
Meanwhile, First Lady Keon-hee, who is in Spain with President Yoon, visited the Korean Cultural Center in Madrid on Tuesday and thanked staff there for promoting Korean culture in the European country and birth nation of Pablo Picasso and Antoni Gaudi. Here's our First Lady.
Here in Spain, cake culture and cake cooking are flourishing. I think this is possible thanks to all the efforts of the staff here. I believe this place deserves more encouragement in the future.
Also at the center, she visited a fashion exhibition featuring Korean traditional attire, the hanbok, and met Spanish students who are interested in learning the Korean language. The Korean Cultural Center opened in Madrid over a decade ago. The venue for this year's NATO summit, Spain, has long been South Korea's close partner. The two countries share over a 50-years-old friendship and economic partnership connected by similar history. Our Kim Da-mi has more.
South Korea is a country respected and recognized by the entire world and the largest Asian economic partner of Spain. That's how Madrid sees Seoul.
우리 함께 존칭 시다. Muchas gracias a todos. 감사합니다.
Tight Seoul-Madrid relations have been mirrored in their lively high-level interactions, namely South Korean President Moon Jae-in's visit to Spain last year. Not only was it Spain's first time to host a state guest since the outbreak of the pandemic, but the trip also came in response to a state visit by Spanish King Felipe VI to Seoul the previous year in celebration of the 70th anniversary of the two countries' friendship. Secured since 1950, their diplomatic ties are deeply rooted in one of their biggest similarities, the spirit of a democracy.
The peoples of both countries overcame civil wars and authoritarianism in the 20th century and achieved democratization in less than a half century, and the two nations are recognized as fully democratic countries in the world.
The same applies to Spain's support of the peace process and complete denuclearization on the Korean peninsula achieved through diplomacy and dialogue. Last year, the two sides upgraded their relations to a strategic partnership and penned MOUs for green energy and digital innovation and startups, elevating their cooperation to a whole new level. The popularity of K-pop and K-dramas in Spain has led to a boost in cultural exchanges too, such as the European country organizing more local Korean cultural festivals. And even as the worst of the pandemic subsided, two-way trade volume between the countries was quick to back on track, hitting nearly $1.6 billion in the first quarter this year. Kim Da-mi, Arirang News.
The Biden administration took a slew of actions against Russia, sanctioning both Russian entities and individuals. Now, the latest move comes on the heels of sanctions announced by the G7 nations. Kim Yo-sun has more.
Washington has unveiled fresh sanctions against Russia, targeting those they say support Moscow's military and defense industrial base. In the latest sanctions announced Tuesday, the U.S. accused Russian military units of abusing human rights in Ukraine and implemented a ban on new imports of Russian gold. The U.S. Treasury Department said in a statement that it blacklisted 29 Russian individuals as well as 70 entities, including state corporation Rostec, a massive state-owned enterprise established to consolidate the country's technological, aerospace, and military industrial expertise. In a separate statement, Secretary of State Antony Blinken announced that the State Department was imposing sanctions on 45 entities and 29 individuals. He added steps were being taken to put in place visa restrictions on over 500 Russian military officers. The move comes on the heels of sanctions announced by G7 leaders, which included a gold import ban. In a joint communique, the G7 also agreed to seek a ban on the transportation of Russian oil that has been sold above a certain price. This is part of the group's plan to examine a new package of actions aimed at increasing pressure on Moscow. The leaders also vowed to continue to provide financial, humanitarian, military, and diplomatic support to Ukraine for as long as necessary. Kim Yo-sun, Arirang News.
Turkey has decided to lift its objection to applications by Finland and Sweden for NATO membership, paving the way for the two countries to join the military alliance. Now, this comes as the three countries signed a memorandum of understanding late Tuesday ahead of the NATO summit over in Madrid. Following the signing ceremony, NATO's chief said that the alliance can always find common ground and resolve issues regardless of the differences its members face. Now, the latest development is a blow to Russia's ambition of rolling back NATO's growth through its war in Ukraine.
After intense back and forth discussions over the minimum wage, South Korea's labor unions and the business community have now each submitted revised proposals. Labor unions lowered their initial request of about $8.40 down to $8, nearly 13% higher than the current wage floor of around $7. Business owners, after first arguing the rate should be frozen, suggested a 1.1% hike. Negotiations will resume at 3 p.m. today at the Minimum Wage Commission in Sejong City, where we're expecting more revisions. If the two sides can't reach an agreement, public interest representatives will put their own proposal up for a vote. Consumers here in the country are feeling the heat from surging prices. The Bank of Korea's monthly survey of roughly 2,500 households in June showed that the future inflation rate, as predicted by the public, hit its highest level in a decade. The central bank said in June that consumers in the country expect inflation to average at 3.9% over the next 12 months. Now, this is up 0.6 percentage points compared to the month before, rising for a fifth month in a row. Amid soaring inflation, consumer sentiment regarding the economy also dropped below the 100 threshold for the first time in more than a year. The central bank's composite consumer sentiment index in June stood at around 96.4, falling 6.2 points on month. A figure below 100 means public opinion on the economy is more pessimistic than optimistic.
Now, by the middle of this century, people who live by themselves are projected to make up 40% of all households here in South Korea. Now, when that time comes, the biggest proportion of this group will likely be older than 70. Shin Ha-young zooms in on this expected phenomenon.
30 years from now, in 2050, 3/4 of South Korean households will have just one or two members. One-person households already accounted for the biggest proportion in 2020. The second biggest proportion of households were married couples with children at 29%. But these families with children will fall to third place by 2050 at just 17.1%. By then, households with just one member will likely rise to 40%. And these individuals will be much older on average than they are now. In 2020, about 37% of people living alone were younger than 40. But by 2050, the largest group of these will be older than 70.
Compared to 2019, the number of unmarried people in single-member households has been increasing at a faster pace. Our estimates also reflect our society's rapid aging and low birth rate.
Because more senior citizens are living alone, an expert says more needs to be done to address the issues of elderly poverty and dying alone.
The biggest problems affecting South Korean seniors are the poverty and mortality rates. The number of seniors dying alone has been increasing rapidly. To solve these problems, we need to strengthen our social welfare policy and facilities so that we can take care of our seniors.
Overall, the number of households in South Korea is likely to hit a peak in 2039 and then go down. 2 years ago, the number of households was around 21 million. The figure is expected to hit almost 24 million by the peak, but will fall to around 23 million in 2050, along with an overall drop in the population. This peak is a year sooner than it was projected 3 years ago. The population as a whole is believed to have already peaked in 2020. Shin Ha-young, Arirang News.
And it's time for On Point, where we speak to experts to delve deeper into some of the key issues in the spotlight right now. Now, the number of teenage felons aged 10 to 13 here in South Korea with no criminal responsibility has seen a steady rise in recent years. Now, this has prompted lawmakers and the Justice Ministry to discuss whether to lower the minimum age of criminal responsibility.
So is this the right move, or is it too harsh on children who may not be fully aware of the implications of their actions? To delve deeper into this, we connect with Cho Hee-kyung, professor at College of Law at Hongik University. Good morning.
Good morning.
All right, so first off, how much of an increase in the number of teenage felons below the age of criminal responsibility are we looking at right now? I mean, how serious is this situation?
So over the last 5 or so years, the number of juvenile offenders, those aged between 10 and 14, has increased by about 56%. So back in 2016, there were about 6,400 juvenile offenders who were essentially who had hearings before the family court and who were sent to detention centers. In the last year, it has increased to close to 10,000. So that is a significant increase over the years.
I mean, also what we've been seeing on the news as well is the severity of the crimes committed appears to be getting worse and worse for those under the minimum age. It does seem right to pass this law to decrease the age, but why would someone actually be against it?
Well, it's true that in the media, the more heinous crimes committed by these juvenile offenders are being reported. But the question is, what is the law for? Because simply increasing punishment for juvenile offenders has shown in a number of studies and research that it doesn't necessarily deter them from committing crimes, nor does it prevent recidivism. In fact, treating these juvenile offenders in the same way as adult offenders and sending them to same kind of prisons is actually there's an increased chance of them turning into a life of crime rather than being rehabilitated and being able to rejoin the society. For young offenders especially, they are so much more easily influenced by external environment and other factors. And so it's really important to give them opportunity to be able to rehabilitate. And the concern is that just lowering the age and not actually improving other factors is going to simply cast them aside and not giving them an opportunity to rehabilitate.
All right, that's a great point there. Now, if they do decide to pass this law, they will have to decide what the new minimum age will be. And now there are talks of lowering it from 14 to 13 or even 14 to 12. So what do you believe should be done?
Well, it's not really the age. I think that's the key factor. The United Nations has certainly recommended that it shouldn't be lower than 12. And we also have to remember that just because they are not tried in the criminal law system, it doesn't mean that they escape liability altogether. Those juveniles between 10 and 14, they can be sent to detention centers for up to a year in order to be able to be rehabilitated. What we need to remember is that adolescent brains are different to adult brains. They have less ability for self-control. They are much more prone to act impulsively. They don't really have the ability to think about long-term consequences. And that becomes increasingly more difficult the younger the offenders are. And so it's not simply about lowering the age to whether 12 or 13, certainly not lower in my opinion, but what we can do to improve the environment of these young people, because very often these young people actually come from an environment of abuse or physical violence themselves. They're in fact victims of domestic abuse or broken homes and so forth. And so we really need to think about not just about increasing punishment and penalties for the juvenile offenders, but also how we can improve their situation so that they are not tempted to commit crimes.
Well, I mean, those that are kind of for the revision of this particular law is saying that, well, if you have the lowering of the age, it's going to scare these kids from kind of, conducting these criminal acts and so forth. So the big question remains, right? Do you think lowering the minimum age will actually result in fewer crimes being committed by these teens?
Right. So we are counting on the deterrence effect of lowering the age and subjecting them to greater punishment. But once again, lots of research have shown, not just in Korea, but in other countries, that simply increasing punishment does not work as deterrence. What we have to do is to improve the living conditions and other factors that influence these young people's lives. And that's really the only way that can effectively reduce their offense rate.
All right, thank you so much for your insights, Professor Cho. Looking forward to speaking to you again in the near future.
Thank you.
All right, with that, that's going to wrap up the first half of New Day at Arirang.
But stick around. Coming up next in the second half, it's 10 years since Deferred Action for Childhood Arrivals, or DACA, was put into effect. But are dreamers stuck in a limbo after 10 years? We find out during Global Insights, so we'll be back in just a moment.
Share South Korea's experience in tackling COVID-19 and introduce a Korean New Deal. A Korean survivor of Japan's wartime sex slavery met with
extraordinary climate crisis and pledged to work with the EU to tackle the challenge.
The objective of its North Korea policy is
protesters gathering across the country to peacefully demand an end to hate and violence.
Arirang, what matters?
I feel so good right now. Maybe I had a drink or two, but this somehow feels like it's forever. All my friends are here having fun and feeling good right now. Maybe this is forever. All my friends are here having fun and feeling good right now. Forever.
Welcome back to the second half of New Day at Arirang. It's monsoon season here in South Korea. We're seeing short, localized downpours, also called guerrilla rainstorms.
That's right. And by Wednesday morning, the lower-lying streets in the capital area could have 30 centimeters or more of standing water. Shin Yeon provides a closer look.
It's going to be a tough few days here in South Korea. We're expecting to see up to 300 millimeters of rain pound the central part of the country until Thursday. This is where most of the population is located, as it includes Gangwon-do Province, Chungcheong-do Province, and the greater capital region.
Here in Seoul, it's been raining on and off, but overnight we're expecting to see so much rain that by Wednesday morning, we're expecting to see water come up 30 centimeters off the ground. That means we'll have to walk with water coming up around here.
On top of heavy rain, we're also expecting strong winds. As of Tuesday afternoon, the country has already issued strong wind advisories across the nation. Seoraksan Mountain in Gangwon-do Province saw wind speeds of 35.4 meters a second, enough to cause violent destruction. In the capital region, wind speeds were recorded at 20 meters per second, breaking down trees and streetlights. The Korea Meteorological Administration says this is due to the growing air pressure gap from winds flowing in from the north and the south. With the monsoon rain belt quickly moving south, the country is going to be under heavy rainfall for the next few days, which is why weather analysts are advising extra caution.
We are expecting to see most of the rain at night, the hardest time for us to take any sort of measures.
We suggest that people should stay indoors and make sure that they have an emergency contact list at hand. We're also asking vacationers near the coast or mountains to be aware of flooding or landslides.
While rainfall will continue throughout the week, southern regions, on the other hand, will see temperatures run high. 신예은, Arirang News.
The air route between Gimpo Airport here in Seoul and Haneda Airport in Tokyo has finally reopened after 2 years and 3 months. Now, it'll be limited to 8 round-trip flights per week starting today, but the number will gradually increase in July in consideration of public demand and airline preparations. The reopening means Gimpo Airport's international terminal and its duty-free stores, which were practically shut down throughout the pandemic, will also resume services. Now, a former South Korean president will be temporarily released from prison for 3 months due to poor health. The Suwon District Prosecutor's Office decided to suspend Myung-bak's sentence upon his request. Lee is currently in hospital and being treated for chronic illnesses and diabetes, with the date of discharge uncertain. The decision comes a year and 7 months after the ex-president began serving a 17-year prison sentence for embezzlement and bribery. Under the law, the execution of a sentence can be suspended if the convicted individual is in poor health, such as being unable to communicate. Only a presidential pardon would enable Lee to be released fully.
It's time for Global Insight, where we speak to experts from around the world on issues making headlines. Now, this year celebrates the 10th anniversary of Deferred Action for Childhood Arrivals, or DACA, in the United States. The administration of then-President Barack Obama created DACA to protect undocumented immigrants who came to the U.S. as children and to help them find work or attend school legally if they meet certain requirements. The DACA program was passed through executive action after Congress failed to pass the American Dream and Promise Act, which was a bill that would put DACA recipients, also known as Dreamers, on path to U.S. citizenship. But now, a decade later, the future of DACA remains uncertain. For more on this, we connect with Henry Cho, a renowned American stand-up comedian from Nashville, Tennessee. Mr. Cho received the 2020 New American Hero Award for his contributions to enhancing the image of Asian immigrants with his decades-long performances. And we also connect with Diana Park, who is a DACA recipient and an immigrant justice organizer at Mingwan Center for Community Action. Thank you so much for joining us today.
Hey, thanks for having me.
Thank you so much for having me.
All right, so Diana, to start us off, for some of us who might not be familiar with this DACA program, tell us in detail what it is and what benefits does it offer?
Sure. DACA stands for Deferred Action for Childhood Arrivals. It was implemented during the Obama administration, and DACA protects immigrant children who came to the United States before their 16th birthday from deportation. DACA gives undocumented immigrants employment authorization document, or EAD. The program requires that DACA status and work permit be renewed every 2 years.
All right, now we heard earlier that DACA recipients are called Dreamers, but then what is the DREAM Act? I mean, we've been hearing people use these terms interchangeably.
Sure. The DREAM Act, also known as the Development, Relief, and Education for Alien Minors Act, permits certain immigrant students who have grown up in the United States to apply for temporary legal status and to eventually obtain permanent legal status, and to become eligible for U.S. citizenship if they go to college or serve in the U.S. military. Not all DACA recipients are Dreamers. People often refer to Dreamers when they're most likely referring to young undocumented people.
All right, then, Henry, now I have a question for you. Then, why are DACA recipients in limbo? I mean, what are some of the hurdles that have been standing in their way of either getting permanent legal status to live in the U.S. or even earning citizenship?
Well, obviously, this is my personal opinion because I'm not an expert. I'm actually a comedian. But, those who are undocumented, they've contributed to the United States. They contribute to the economy. And as long as you're not a convicted felon or a criminal or have any charges, there's no reason you shouldn't be here to apply for citizenship and better the United States.
Right. Well, now considering that a large number of Asian immigrants from South Korea, as well as China and India, are also part of this program, how do changes in DACA policies affect Koreans or East Asians in general, Diana?
There are currently around 600,000 DACA recipients living in the United States. The changes in DACA policies have allowed DACA recipients to live relatively normal lives, holding steady jobs with employment authorization, starting their own businesses and families. It's important to know that unlike their first generation parents, DACA recipients are changing the narrative on what an Asian American looks like today. We are no longer confined to the stereotypes of laundromat owners, nail salon owners, restaurant owners. We're entrepreneurs, writers, chefs, activists, the list goes on.
Now, Henry, I mean, obviously you're living in the States, and recently we have seen a surge of Asian hate crimes over in the U.S., and that raises concerns for us about how Asians living in the States. So is there anything being done to support Asian Americans there?
You know, it's a very sad state when anyone's targeted just because of what they look like or where they're from. It's just bad all around. It's been part of not only the United States, part of the world for generations. I don't know if it's going to go away, but the Asian hate crimes, I don't get it. It makes no sense to me how these really the elderly and small, frail Asian, just like you just saw right there, that's an older Asian man. I mean, how can you do anything to somebody like that? So I think there is more knowledge about it now. The public's aware of it more than they were 10 years ago, 20 years ago when it was happening once in a blue moon. Now that, unfortunately, it's happening a lot. So it's getting more attention. So people are more aware. So hopefully more will be done about it.
All right, now, Henry, experts did talk about how the DACA recipients or dreamers significantly contributed to the American economy, and I know you talked about this a little bit earlier. Tell us more about how Asian Americans are really putting their efforts into the American economy and public coffers.
You know, something I've always talked about, you know, because I'm an American, I was born here, and my parents immigrated 70 years ago, became U.S. citizens. And people ask me all the time, I said, you know, Asians are hardworking people. I said, you don't see homeless Asian people. You just don't. They work too hard. Not here in the United States. Maybe in other parts of the world, yes. But predominantly in the United States, you don't see that around here. And, you know, as Diane was saying, you know, the stereotypes are gone. I mean, they're entrepreneurs. You can own banks. I mean, heck, I'm a stand-up comedian. I've been doing this over 36 years. All the younger generations, they tell me all the time that they had no idea we were allowed to do what I'm doing. So we've shattered that myth of what we're capable of and what we're allowed to do. And, you know, I was supposed to be a doctor or play the cello.
All right.
But I tell jokes.
Right. I mean, we're glad that you decided to take this path, obviously, and you are a real hope for a lot of Asian Americans who wish to walk in that path. Now, Diana, when former U.S. President Barack Obama signed the executive order creating DACA, he did so knowing that future presidents could obviously easily undo it. And of course, former President Donald Trump repealed DACA, but then President Joe Biden reinstated it in January of last year. So why is there so much controversy over this program?
The United States has a history of divisiveness and deep-rooted racism against immigrants. We see this by the resurgence of replacement theory. It's very much an us versus them mentality, coupled with a lack of understanding and media coverage leaves the general American people misinformed and frustrated on what DACA exactly is.
All right. Well, now we know that DACA recipients are obviously at crossroads, and what needs to be done really? I mean, in order to come up with not just a permanent or a temporary rather, but a permanent solution for DACA individuals in your respect.
The DACA program, though it was a godsend for children of immigrants like myself, to establish and foster their lives in the United States, the program is just not viable in the long term. It's a step in the right direction, certainly, but there needs to be a fixation on undocumented folks that cannot qualify for DACA as well. They're largely left behind and unrecognized because of media's preference of DACA recipients. The program itself relies on conditional requirements that excludes those with criminal history, age, and lack of education background. It's a form of job exploitation and a recruitment of skilled and specialized labor. We need a pathway to citizenship that takes into account all undocumented folks, no matter these stipulations. There must be a way to allow those seeking refuge to begin their lives here without the fear of deportation.
All right, Diana, I know that you're an immigrant justice organizer at Mingguan Center for Community Action. Tell us more about what you do there and what your role is there.
Sure. So I work mostly with the community members to figure out the community members' needs and really advocate for undocumented folks who don't have a voice. And you see this with Asian undocumented folks especially, that there is still a stigma of really storytelling, getting our stories out there has been the biggest obstacle. And a lot of the work that I do is really telling my own story to empower other undocumented Asian folks that are really on the fence of, do I want my story to be heard? And if I can really spark change and make that change for others, then I really hope that it can really make a profound difference.
And then I know that you were part of the rally in front of the Congress this month, right? Tell us more about what that was about.
It was about this whole movement is about finding a pathway to citizenship. We definitely have garnered a lot of attention over these rallies, but again, with all the craziness that's happening in this country, undocumented folks do feel a certain burden. We are feeling unseen and unheard still because the issue of immigrant rights have really been left in the dark. So a lot of that has been about like gathering voices and gathering people together to really combat the lack of media exposure around this immigration issue.
All right, Henry, now we know that you, as an American citizen, but you, as an Asian American and a stand-up comedian there in the States, so you must have gone through some difficulties as an Asian American stand-up comedian. So tell us more about that.
Yeah, you know, the crazy thing is, when I started, I was basically one of two Asian comedians. It was myself and Keon-hee. Phil's Chinese, and we were it. And so we kind of stuck out. People were like, wow, what are those two guys doing? He was in New York. I was in Tennessee, but then I moved to LA, so I had the West Coast covered. He had the East Coast covered. But there is always, auditioning for roles and everything else. They'd always hand me a script that was really derogatory and broken English. And, Pat Morita and Key Luke, who were big-time actors here in the States, they both told me, you're the guy. You can say no, so say no to all those bad roles. So that's what I did for decades. And I try not to do anything derogatory toward the Asian community, whether it be Korean or Asians as a whole. It's been my goal and something I strive to do. My daughter is embracing her Korean side. She's actually coming to Korea for the first time this summer to learn the language, and she's a big K-pop girl and all that stuff. So I've learned more through her recently about the new Korean culture with going through BTS. I mean, heck, I saw them at James Corden show because I'd been on the other side of the camera. Right. I've been on that stage, and for the first time in my life, I was actually in the audience. and when they were there. And the cameramen were looking at me going, "What are you doing here?" I said, "I'm here for my daughter because she's a big BTS fan."
Right.
So there is a stigma, there is racism in Hollywood. Doing all we can to make that go away. It's really hard because the writing will still be there for Asian characters to speak with Asian accents, which is fine as long as it's done in the right context and it's not done ugly and to be funny, because it's not funny if someone has an accent. If someone has an Australian accent, no one laughs because they have an Australian accent. Or a French accent, somebody speaking English with a French accent, no one laughs at that. But for some reason, if someone has an Asian accent and they say something in English, for some reason that's funny, and it's not.
Right. Well, definitely I stand with you on that. Now, obviously being one of the very few Asian Americans featured on mainstream television in the U.S., I mean, how do you see yourself impacting young Asian Americans, including young Korean Americans who want to become the next generation of new American heroes like yourself? I mean, tell us about what this new American hero is, first of all.
It was the American Korean Friendship Society. And a lot of the military was there, and it was eye-opening to me. The man, Sonny Park, who presented me with the award, he immigrated here when he was 30, and he's 80 years old now. And he thanks the military every day because during the Korean War, the military came and saved his life. They gave him clothes, they gave him food, and he was able to come over here to the United States and start a new life. And the American military, along with the South Korean army, saved his life. So he owes everything to them. It was the first time I've actually seen that straight up told from somebody. And my mom was in the audience sitting next to me, and she was just nodding her head. And so a lot of military was there. That's where it came from. The award comes from. I'm undeserving. I'm humbled. I'm flattered. I'm honored that they would choose me to represent, be the recipient of 2020. And then, of course, with COVID, we had to postpone the ceremony till just recently.
All right. Well, we thank you so much for your insight and your time today. And thank you for walking that difficult path in the States, wherever you are. So that was Henry Cho, American stand-up comedian, and Diana Park, immigrant justice organizer at Minkwon Center for Community Action, with their insights. Thank you again.
Hey, great to see you. Great to meet you. You look wonderful.
Thank you.
Now, people in their 20s and 30s here in South Korea appear to be turning their eyes on daily sports like golf and tennis. Now, some of them say it's because they like to take pictures of themselves and post it on their social media. Our Lee Hyun zooms in on this phenomenon.
Ever heard of playing sports just to take pictures? That's what's happening now among Generation MZs in Korea. Playing golf is a good example. Golf used to be considered as a sport for those in middle age. But now, people in their 20s and 30s are enthusiastic about this because they like to take photos and post it in their social media accounts.
I like to wear nice golf clothes and take pictures with my family and friends when I go golfing.
Golf courses are well organized, so they're good for taking pictures. I upload pictures to my social media to show people that I play golf.
If you search for the hashtag 골린이, meaning golf beginner in Korean, there are thousands of posts from young people playing golf. A pro golfer and a coach who teaches at one of the indoor centers says he sees a wide range of age groups these days.
Even my friends who are in their 20s to 30s ask me to go out and play golf with them. I think after the outbreak of COVID-19, more young people are considering taking up golf as a hobby.
According to statistics released by Korea Leisure Industry Institute, a total of 5.1 million people played golf in 2021. Among them, the number of people in their 20s and 30s stood at over 1.1 million. That's a 35% increase from a year earlier. That's why golfwear companies are now targeting young people with their designs and are getting K-pop stars to model for them. But it's not just golf that's gaining popularity. Tennis is also loved by young people, as is the apparel.
I buy tennis outfits every time I have a game. Style is always important to me.
As people in their 20s and 30s are buying more tennis clothing, more brands are starting to sell tennis clothes too.
A consumer trend expert says this phenomenon is due to young people's needs for healthy pleasure.
Healthy pleasure means that people prefer to have a sense of pleasure while pursuing a healthy life. So, to Generation MZs, playing sports means more than just enjoying it. They want to feel connected as they play sports.
She added that as social media is a tool for young people to connect with others, sports with fancy apparel and equipment like golf and tennis allow them to stay active online and offline. Lee Hyun, Arirang News.
Let's take a look at what's going on in the world now. Scotland has announced plans to hold a second independence referendum on October 19, 2023. The statement was made on Tuesday by Scotland's First Minister Nicola Sturgeon, who also pledged to take the issue to the Supreme Court should the British government attempt to block the vote. Sturgeon has asked for formal consent of the secession vote from UK Prime Minister Boris Johnson in a written letter, but plans to press ahead regardless of the response. In the previous 2014 referendum, 55% of Scottish voters decided against independence, but this was followed by the Brexit vote less than 2 years later, which the majority of Scots rejected. The UK government has said it will examine the First Minister's latest proposals, but added that, quote, now is not the time for a referendum. Bulgaria is expelling 70 Russian diplomats, calling them a threat to national security. The decision was announced by Bulgaria's outgoing Prime Minister on Tuesday over concerns of espionage amid increased tensions over Russia's invasion of Ukraine. The expulsion is the largest such move by the Balkan country following the expulsion of 10 representatives in March. Less than half of Russia's diplomatic staff in Bulgaria will remain, and Moscow's representation in the country will be limited to just 48 people. The expelled Russian diplomats have been ordered to leave the country by July 3rd. At 101 years of age, the oldest Nazi criminal to ever stand trial in a German court was found guilty on Tuesday of aiding and abetting the murders of around 3,500 people. Named Josef S. during proceedings, in accordance with German privacy laws, the former SS guard was handed a 5-year prison sentence for being complicit in the shooting of Soviet prisoners of war and the gassing of other prisoners to death. The former guard worked at Sachsenhausen concentration camp for 3 years during the Second World War, overseeing a facility that saw tens of thousands die from medical experiments, forced labor, murder, and starvation. Tesla CEO Elon Musk has reached another milestone, surpassing 100 million followers on Twitter. According to data analysis company Social Blade, Musk reached the 9-digit follower count on June 27th after jumping up by an additional 150,000 followers. This comes as Musk is attempting to buy the social media platform for $44 billion. Musk is the 6th most followed person on Twitter, behind former US President Barack Obama, singers Justin Bieber, Katy Perry and Rihanna, and footballer Cristiano Ronaldo. Musk first created a Twitter account in June 2009 and made his first official post in June 2010, where he asked people to ignore tweets from fake pages of him. Matthew Ashley, Arirang News.
Good morning. The capital region saw heavy overnight downpours. Severe weather continues across Korea today. And right now, parts of central regions are being drenched, getting 10 millimeters of rain an hour. And until tomorrow, central regions could be seeing up to 250 millimeters of more rainfall. Again, heavy overnight rain is forecast to pound the country, which could lead to road closures due to high water in the capital tomorrow. Well, for now, the rain advisory has been lifted in most parts except in Sejong and surrounding areas. But a strong wind advisory still remains in place along coastal regions and in Seoul. And a heat advisory remains in effect in Gyeongsang-do provinces, Daegu and Jeju today. Again, a very warm and humid start to the day. In fact, Gangneung in Gangwon-do province had overnight temperatures hovering around 30 degrees Celsius. And by the afternoon, Seoul will be topping out at 27, Daegu at 29, but humidity will make it feel muggier. With that, here's a look at the weather conditions around the globe.
And that's going to wrap up our newscast for this hour, but we'll be back tomorrow for our Thursday's edition of New Day at Arirang.
Thanks for being with us, and do stick around for more updates throughout the day. Have a great rest of your day wherever you are. Goodbye.